encountering God who sometimes doesn't make sense. The prominent skeptics of our day, of course, would say that God never makes sense. Perhaps some believers might claim that God always makes sense. We just don't see it. For those of us who may regard ourselves as theologically astute, culturally and historically aware, and hermeneutically correct, may claim that at least sometimes God doesn't make sense. I suppose we could all easily begin an unending list of examples. We could point to an array of natural events that produce incalculable consequences: hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, tornadoes, and on and on. We could point to the ripple effects of human action or inaction that murder and maim and molest the innocent. These so-called natural evils and moral evils are often launched against God. How could He allow such suffering? Now, it's bad enough when we encounter the anguish of others, but the fact is we all very personally confront calamity and catastrophe. My family has had its share. 2012 in some ways was a hallmark year for us, not necessarily in a good sense. On January 1st of 2012, my father-in-law, Paul Odom, passed away with cancer. In April of that year, my mom died, who lived here in town with us. In May of that year, one of my sons-in-law's brother died at a relatively young age of cancer as well. What you see on screen now is a picture of my great-grandnephew's car. See a picture here of him and his sister, Emily. The amazing thing is that as bad as that car was totaled, and the fact is that there was hardly a square inch or so inside that vehicle that was not splattered with his blood, John survived that accident. About a year later, in July of 2012, his sister Emily was driving at about the same place on the same road and was killed instantly. "16 years old she was at the time." What you see on now is the best-looking family, or at least among them, that you would ever encounter. This is my son, Andy, and his wife, Lindsay, and their two little kids. This picture was taken earlier in 2015. This picture was taken later in 2015. In late July, our 33-year-old daughter-in-law, Lindsay, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Within a month, she had a double mastectomy. Within another month, she was beginning chemotherapy. That's tough. This was yesterday. After 23 weeks of chemotherapy. Yesterday was her last. You see, one way that we could approach all this is to offer some kind of comprehensive theodicy to try to make sense out of how such suffering and tragedy can exist in our world, and yet for there to be an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. Especially to those of us who believe. We could offer, and I do in some of my courses, I talk about free will theodicy that can help to account for a lot of moral evil in our world, the kind that results from freely chosen human action or inaction. We can talk about the soul-making theodicy that can help to explain how human suffering can actually produce valuable human virtues like patience and enhance our sense of dependence upon God. We could talk about natural law theodicy that can help to explain the prerequisite conditions for human moral responsibility. But that also makes natural evil inevitable. Now, I think that these kind of considerations are helpful. I certainly don't think they're sufficient. There is much more that can be done and should be done theologically to bring the quiver of theology to bear, to try to answer some of these very perplexing and difficult questions. But even with all of that, I don't really think that this audience is that concerned about a comprehensive theodicy attempt. You, and even the text that we will look at this morning, I think are much more concerned about the idea of God not making sense within the context of kingdom leadership. See, my faith, to be quite honest with you, is not gigantically challenged because of natural tragedy or a life-changing or life-taking disease or the senseless violence that might occur at the hands of a mentally disturbed individual or an extremist religious terrorist. But as a 15-year-old son of a preacher, I remember my dad preaching for a church where the eldership changed the lock on his office door. I remember some very unpleasant congregational meetings. And God did not seem to make much sense then. He didn't seem to make much sense when Bob Kirka, who had apparently been groomed for decades, had been elected president of St. Louis Christian College and then had to withdraw because of a newly discovered heart condition. His more recently contracted cancer tempts me just to wonder, does God really make sense? I'm sure you have your own set of examples or memories, and maybe some of you are experiencing right now some things that would prompt you to wonder, does God really make sense? Now, I certainly hope you don't operate with a simplistic and theologically implausible notion that somehow God causes everything to happen. But even so, I still am prompted to ask, why? How do these things make sense? Especially when they adversely affect our Christian service. Sometimes I think we are just almost forced to say it just doesn't make sense. Now, I think that our thoughts, at least the ones going through my mind just now, perhaps yours, our thoughts are probably not that much different from what is implied in our assigned text for today in Deuteronomy 3 and Deuteronomy 34. I actually think that the text, as we look at it, provides some constructive insights on how we can respond when, and perhaps especially when, God just doesn't seem to make sense. There's a rich heritage, of course, in all of this, with Moses at the backdrop, as you may well know from the book of Deuteronomy. He's recounting much of what has transpired in his life. I think that Moses undoubtedly had to have thought that there were many times when God didn't make sense. Certainly he didn't think God made sense at the burning bush. You want me to do what? You want me to face off to Pharaoh? That just didn't make sense. The idea of God making sense undoubtedly came to his mind when he led those people out of Egypt. He had invested so much in the mission of God only to discover repeatedly that they were a bunch of ungrateful grumblers who were often disinterested and disobedient. He likely was led to think that God didn't make much sense when they voted for somebody else to lead them. You see any parallels with your church ministry? Moses led them through the Red Sea. He conveyed the 10 Commandments to them. He interceded for Israel when God had expressed at one point he was giving them up and starting over. You see, all of that didn't seem to make sense. He came to Meribah and this great rock that was there. They had nothing to drink and they needed some kind of miracle. And God provided it, but Moses and Aaron, they did something not quite right. Numbers 20 tells us how Moses and Aaron gave them water, striking the rock. But as I said, they didn't do it quite right. And God told them, you're not getting in the promised land. I can imagine Moses saying, are you kidding me? A rock? A rock comes between me and experiencing the promised land? It just doesn't make sense. Then when the Israelites got to the promised land, they sent in the 12 spies. That's the 10 were bad and 2 were good thing. In Deuteronomy 1, text tells us that Moses, as he's recounting part of this story, it says that the Lord was angry with me also on your account, saying, not even you will enter there. Wow, how sensible is that? I'm somehow being held culpable on your account? Deuteronomy 3, 40 years after leaving Egypt, Moses offers a personal plea, an appeal to God. I also pleaded with the Lord at the time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Let me, I pray, cross over and see the fair land that is beyond the Jordan, the good hill country of Lebanon. I think Moses, even though he was told he's not going to get in, he's pleading with God nonetheless. He said, look, God, you can do this. You can change your mind if you want. You can make it happen. But God gets angry at Moses. He wouldn't even listen to him. Basically, he said, zip it. I don't want to hear you. I can understand why Moses could well have said, this just doesn't make sense. In Deuteronomy 34, we have the account about the death of Moses. In verse 1 of chapter 34, Moses goes up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land. Yep, there was a sign up there that gave him a geographical orientation of where he was headed. Just so you know. Now it could have been worse for Moses. I mean, let's face it. In the first place, he's 120 years old. And one of the things that would have come to my mind is, I got to climb another mountain? 120. I've got enough of this mountain stuff. So, let's get past that. But at 120, he might have been half blind, terribly feeble. Can you imagine the scenario? He does finally, get up the mountain, and God is going to show him the land. But, he's got the eyes of a... I think I see some. But that's not what happened, is it? In fact, verse 7 of the chapter tells us that although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. See, God let him see when he could still see. Well, Moses ends up dying. on that mountain not to come down again. And we wonder, I think, how can we make sense of what doesn't seem to make sense? I think, however, if we look a little more in Deuteronomy 3 and 34, we might be able to sift through some senseless rock and find some glitters of instructive gold that could provide some direction for us as we try to make sense of things when they don't seem to make sense. One insight that I see in the text is this: even when God doesn't make sense, remember what he has done that does make sense. The primary point is this: God has done great things, you have experienced them, and they make sense. In chapter 3, where the text recounts the various conquests of the Israelites, Moses says in verse 21, he says, "Your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings. And they were great." I mean, Og had a bedstead, presumably that was 9 cubits by 4 cubits. He was a big bad dude. And yet, God saw them through it. He defeated that powerful enemy as we come to chapter 34, verses 10 to 12. The text says, "Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, all his land, for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of Israel." You see, Moses witnessed God's power. He experienced personally God's deliverance. He knew God face to face. And in light of God's plan, all of that made sense. He understood that God was in control. So, what did make sense was able to trump what didn't make sense. By the way, I did not mean to give a political endorsement, just that. Now, we have not tossed a staff to generate a snake. And we've not seen a sea parted so that our congregation can walk through. And we have not struck a rock that would bring fresh water to Flint, Michigan. But we have experienced the Lord in our life. We have seen the power of God transform marriages, perhaps our own. We have shared the exuberant joy of those who realize that their sins have been forgiven. We have witnessed the calming presence of God at times of tremendous distress and even death. While such things may be incomprehensible in the eyes of the world, we know that in light of God's power and in light of God's plan, this makes sense. And what does make sense can carry us through the times that don't seem to make sense. There's another glitter of gold, I think, that instructs us. Even when God doesn't make sense, recall his fulfilled promises in the past. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 4, that's the passage, chapter that begins by God showing Moses this promised land. But notice what it says in verse 4. "Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants.'" Do you see what the text is doing here? It's connecting us to the faithfulness of God to those in the past. God basically is saying, I promised this to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to their descendants. Moses, you are in that line. Remember what I have promised. Remember that I have delivered it. And Moses, I think, was able to say, I'm not in this alone. I'm connected to a community that God has faithfully blessed. I can trust this God because he has fulfilled his promises. And these promises, I think, are extended to us in a wonderful way. Because the same God whose promises were fulfilled to Abraham and to Moses is the same God whose promises are being fulfilled for us. Apostle Paul in Galatians 3 puts it this way: if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring and heirs according to the promise. In Romans chapter 4, as Paul is talking about the faith of Abraham, he says, with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully assured that what God had promised, he was able also to perform. That is what made it possible for it to be reckoned to him as righteousness. You see, we have encountered the promised propitiation of our sin. We have experienced the promised presence of the Holy Spirit, for the promise is to us and our children. So even when God doesn't seem to make sense, recall his promises in the past that connect us to a redeemed community to whom God has fulfilled and is fulfilling his promises. Third, even when God doesn't make sense, renew your kingdom commitment for the future. As he came to the end of his life, Moses could well have become so disgruntled and devastated to the point of jealousy. He invested a lot. And he had more to give. You remember the text? His eyes had not failed. His vigor was still there. He had more to give. That's part of the reason why it didn't make sense. He could have become bitter. He was told he wasn't going to see the fruit of his work. But look what Moses actually did. Deuteronomy 34, verse 9. It says, now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. You see, Moses did not become bitter, nor did he become jealous. He had the vision of God's bigger plan, and he had the heart to surrender to it. He personally participated in authorizing someone else who would take his place. He committed himself to the future of God's kingdom, even when it didn't make sense. Wow. His example is certainly relevant to those of us who have and perhaps may in the future be forced to move from one ministry or church to another, especially when you don't think it makes sense. What he did is significant for those whose ministry skills may become inadequate for certain ministry. It is evident to those in the kingdom leadership who may encounter some kind of debilitating disease, a life-changing accident, or the liabilities of older age. You see, it's difficult enough to grow older gradually and gracefully. I think perhaps it's even more challenging to experience sudden developments that radically reduce or perhaps even prevent our ongoing Christian service. You see, there are times when God just doesn't seem to make sense. In the process of the last 23 weeks that my daughter-in-law has had cancer and chemotherapy for it, we've learned a few things. We've learned that it is a terribly grueling process that is filled with disappointment and sometimes devastation. But at the end of the chemotherapy treatment, this is another thing we've discovered. There's a ritual of sorts. From my understanding, it's pretty well standard fare, I guess you'd say. For that chemotherapy patient, after that very last treatment, he or she goes over to typically a wall, and hanging on that wall is a bell. And they are invited and encouraged to ring that bell. It symbolizes the completion of a long, very difficult process, and the inception, the gateway to a new life. That's what happened yesterday. Lindsay rang that bell. But I will admit to you, there were a lot of times in the process where it just seemed like God did not make sense. We may face extremely difficult times that could be life-changing or ministry-altering. And we may believe at times that God just doesn't make sense. Even when those times come, remember what God has done that does make sense. Recall his fulfilled promises in the past and renew your commitment to kingdom work for the future. There will come a time when you will be able to ring a bell. And given God's redemptive plan and the coming consummation, I think that it will lead to a time when you will say, in fact, God makes sense.